So Wright-Locke Farm is a Winchester's community farm. We're a 20-acre parcel here in the western side of Winchester, and we are a community farm. We are a nonprofit, and what we do is try to engage our community in farming and things related to farms. So we welcome people to come anytime. It doesn't have to be to a formal event like this, but feel free to come up and enjoy a stroll at the farm. Maybe you want to volunteer on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday in the fields with Adrian, our farmer, picking vegetables for our farmers markets or our CSA. Maybe you want to help out with our farm education program. We have a very robust farm education program for kids and adults alike. Or maybe you want to come to our family farm night on Thursday nights. We have a free concert series throughout the summer. It's a great draw. We're doing everything we can to engage our community in this farm, and we are very thankful for our community because they provide us the energy that we have been able to generate and maintain here at the farm, and provide the support and encouragement for many of the things we do. Ruth Trimarchi is our flower operations manager, and she is always promoting the flower volunteer operations. So I'm not going to go on much further, but to say welcome. Thank you for supporting us. We hope to have your continued support as we evolve as a farm and as evolve as a resource for Winchester. And what I'd like to do is introduce Kim Nealon, who is our community engagement manager. And Kim has been instrumental in developing and running our speaker series. This is our second year. This is the second evening of our second year. And Kim has been involved in finding quality speakers and organizing the event and all the back of the house, in front of the house activities. So Kim will introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Archie, for that. And good evening, everyone. Thank you again for coming out. Like Archie was saying, this is the second year that we've done this, and it's just really been amazing to see how much it's grown and how, just everybody's coming out here to come and to learn. That's something that's really inspiring to me about our community. And again, just this hunger for knowledge. So I really appreciate you being here and giving your attention to these wonderful speakers here. We've also been so fortunate to have such accomplished speakers come and generously donate their time and energy to share their knowledge with us. We hope to really keep this educational event free so all can join without any obstacles. But that said, it does not come without costs on our end as well. So if you are inspired by this night, this event tonight, and hope to see the programming continue, please just welcome you to consider donating on your way out. We do have first, she'll be speaking second, but I'll introduce Isabel Brofsky first. She's a master's student in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her research focuses on the conservation of shrubland birds on small, diversified farms in New England, and she has spent the past 2 summers conducting bird and habitat surveys across 23 farms. Originally from Western Washington, Isabel received her undergraduate degree in wildlife ecology at Washington State University. And then before starting her graduate program, she did work for the National Audubon Society's Project Puffin in Maine, as well as work for Hawkwatch International in the mountains of Nevada. So she's coming from all over the place. It's great. And then we'll also be hearing from Dr. Kimberly Peters tonight. She is the senior biologist at a global risk management and consulting firm where she provides environmental and wildlife support to wind and solar developers. Over the last 20 years, though, she's led research and conservation programs on migratory shorebirds, grassland birds, wind energy, bird and bat fatalities, and bird aircraft strike risk. Kim has served as senior scientist and director of bird monitoring at New Jersey Audubon, chief scientist and director of bird conservation at Mass Audubon, and visiting assistant professor at Wheaton College. She received her Master of Science in Fisheries and Wildlife Science from North Carolina State University and received her PhD in Zoology from Clemson University. Her primary interests are in migration ecology, coastal ecology, and full life cycle analysis with a focus on potential conflicts at the human-wildlife interface. So we are so excited to have both of these experts at the farm today to share their knowledge with us. So without further ado, just please help me welcome them to the stage.
Okay, so thank you, and I promise I'm not going to be talking about interfaces or anything like that tonight. I forgot that was in my bio. But one thing I wanted to talk about really quickly before I get into the meat of my talk is that Ruth and Kim first reached out to me because I had signed up for a list through an organization, a nonprofit called 500 Women Scientists. Has anybody heard of this organization before? It was brand new. It was started after the 2016 elections, and it was a way to keep, like week it started. So it was a way to get more women who are engaged in science together and to find common ground and work together and support each other. And I signed up and just added my name to a list, thinking nothing would ever come of it. And then I heard from Ruth. She said, "I found you on this list. Would you come do a talk?" So when I leave here, I'm going to contact them and tell them the system is working the way it's supposed to. And just to give them a shout out, I want to read their mission. So their mission is to empower women to grow to their full potential in science, increase scientific literacy through public engagement, and advocate for science and equality. All good things. So yay, 500 women scientists. Okay, so today, the structure of our talk, I'm going to go first, and what I'm going to do is provide a broad overview of birds and agriculture and the interaction between the two. Mainly why we care, why do we care about birds on farms, what birds do for farms, and then alternatively what farms can do for birds. Do they provide good bird habitat? And then what we can do as consumers and landowners in order to encourage that. And then Isabel's going to get up and talk more about some of the specific research that she's doing out in the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts, working specifically with shrubland birds and small farms. Right? So I usually start with a little bit about me slide, and because Kim already went pretty deeply into my bio, I'm just going to say I'm a Mass native. I went to school down south for most of my degrees. I got my undergrad at BC. But I've worked on birds now for 25 years. Like, I really care about this stuff. So I've worked with gray jays in Vermont, was the first job I ever had, and down south with birds on forested areas. I know we have some birders in the crowd. That's a Swainson's warbler for anybody who's interested. They're like one of the coolest birds in the world, and that's what gave me my master's degree. And then my PhD was done on American oyster catchers. And then since then, I've done a lot of work in South America and Suriname and French Guiana, and also worked on grassland birds quite a bit. So tonight, I'm going to focus on grassland birds. So why do we care then? There are a lot of birds that actually use farms. Like, farms are not wastelands for birds. And most importantly, they serve as habitat for grassland birds, like eastern meadowlarks. We've got a grasshopper sparrow, bobolink here. Also aerial insectivores. For those of you who are not bird nerds like myself, those are birds like swifts and swallows that actually eat, as we say, on the wing. So they're the ones you see eating insects up in the air. And also shrubland birds. And I'm going to leave that because that is really Isabel's specialty, and she's going to be talking a lot about shrubland birds. I'm going to focus on the top two groups as we go forward. So I usually start these talks with a couple of really depressing slides, but I promise you it will not stay this way through the talk, so just bear with me here. We care because these groups of birds are in serious, serious decline. Birds associated with open land. So grassland birds are experiencing across their range, so across North America, 1.2% decrease annually. Shrubland birds are down at 7.74%, and aerial insectivores down 1.86%. They are three of the groups experiencing the sharpest declines out there in terms of birds. And it may not seem like a lot, but if you do the math, a species that is going down a 1.5% a year, there in 50 years there's going to be less than half of them left. In 100 years you're down to less than 25% of the population. So it's pretty, it happens rapidly, and once you get down to really small populations, then crazy things can happen, like a disease can cause an extinction, and they're gone, and they're gone forever. So why are these birds in decline? Well, in big part, it is because of what has happened out here in the Midwest. In the shortgrass prairie regions of the Dakotas or the mixed prairie region of the Dakotas, west in Montana, and then the tallgrass prairie in sort of the Midwest area. And what has happened, this is the habitats that most of these species really depended on in their evolutionary history. But this stuff is kind of gone now. And here's where I'm going to read some kind of sad stats. Okay, so according to the Environmental Working Group study from 2012, 24 million acres of grassland, shrublands, and wetlands were converted to crop production between 2008 and 2011. So this gets worse. Tallgrass prairie in North America has been reduced to less than 4% of its original cover. If you take all of them together, more than 97% of the native grasslands of the U.S. have been lost, mostly because of conversion to high-intensity agriculture out west, also because of development. And therefore, that's why we're losing these birds at super fast rates. Yeah, but moving a little bit closer to home, we have kind of a different issue. And this is just a time warp to show you what has happened in terms of agriculture across the country. In the mid-1980s, most of the agriculture was here in the east. And as we expanded west into the early 1900s, the core of agriculture, people were taking advantage of these really nutrient-rich soils out where the prairies were, and that's where the core of agriculture happened. This is also the period when a lot of these birds that were native to the Midwest moved east, because now they had habitat all the way across and they moved in. So some of these birds we didn't have in high numbers before, some of them we didn't have at all before. But then through the 20th century, you can see agriculture in the east has declined. So what happened was that now all the agriculture is occurring out here, and a lot of this area is being developed. It's very urban, suburban, as you know, and also reforestation. So specifically in Massachusetts, over the past 40 years, we've had about 30% loss in crop and agriculture in the state. It was about 400,000 acres in 1971, and about 150,000 of those acres are gone. Half of those to development, so suburbia, basically, and malls. And then about half of it reverted to forest. So we live in an area that really, really wants to be forest. So if you just turn away, you're going to get forest back. It wants to come back. And the patterns are different across the state, too. So this is something I believe Mass Audubon put together, and I'll confirm that later. But where grassland has been lost in Massachusetts, if you look out in the western part of the state, it's primarily reforestation. So most of the agricultural land and the grasslands we've lost out there are because we get back into forest. Here, again, you see the red is where we've had the conversion. In the east, it makes sense. Most of our grassland and agricultural loss has been because of suburban development. So here's what we know. What happens on farms matters to a lot of birds. And as we just discussed, primarily out west, it's happened because of expansion of agriculture and agricultural intensification. And when I talk about agricultural intensification, I'm talking about conversion to monocultures. So these giant farms with just corn or just soybeans. We also see more pesticide use, more herbicide use. Farms are now, they're considered neater, so you see fewer hedgerows, you see fewer scrubby kinds of habitats, which farmers think of, they just think they look bad, they're dirty, they're not aesthetic. And less edgy, so there's not sort of, little forested areas or little wetlands. It's very sort of monotypic. And there's also the growth of factory farms as well, so fewer pastures and hay fields. And here in the east, like we just talked about, most of the loss has been because of conversion of these smaller farms, typically smaller farms, conversion into development areas and forests, but also some intensification here in the east as well. So here's what we want to know more about. And I just want to make the point that a lot of the research that I'm going to present today is done nationally and internationally. So there's very few data from New England and even fewer from Massachusetts. So there's a really great need for us to understand what's going on with our birds and our farms, which is why it's really exciting what Isabel's doing with her work and some of our colleagues at UMass. So what I'm going to talk about now is, are birds good for farms? These are the questions we want to answer. Which farms are good for birds? So what are the specific characteristics of farms that make habitat good for birds? And then are there any win-wins where it's good for farmers and for birds? And can we find those? So first question, are birds good for farms? Okay, so birds forage on crops, right? So they eat the pests off of crops. And there's quite a bit, this was white. This was supposed to be black, I think, unless it went away. Oh, here it is. Okay. She said she turned some of my text into white by mistake. Okay, so birds eat pests, okay? There have been multiple studies. I'm just going to sort of talk about some general findings. It has been found that birds foraging in crop vegetation, they will consume numerous lepidopteran larvae, also grasshoppers and beetles. Insects consumed include green stink bugs, imported cabbage worm, and numerous dipterans, so flies and mosquitoes. These are all, for the most part, bugs that farmers don't want on their crops. So in that sense, it's really good. Studies have shown that birds reduce pests at an increase, and it will result in an increased growth of trees for any kind of forestry culture. Coffee plants, apple trees, and broccoli, just to name a few. Doesn't work, right? At the same time, birds can be pests, right? So, and this is sort of the paradigm of thinking over time, is that birds come in and farmers didn't initially want them on their farms because they think they're actually just eating all the crops. However, arthropods, I'm just, before I go into birds as pests, I just want to talk about a little bit of data here, that some of the data show that arthropods tend to go down as the number of bird species on a farm goes up, which is kind of interesting. So you get into this idea of species richness, as we say in ecology, or diversity. And across all studies, the birds tended to reduce arthropods. So we're looking down here, we're looking at the number of migrant bird species. Migrants tend to be the best for farms. And you can see the amount of arthropod reduction. So as the number of species goes up, all arthropods go up, reduction in all arthropods, and also a reduction in large arthropods. And the large arthropods are usually the problematic species. And this holds true across various kinds of agriculture, including agroforestry, traditional coffee, polycultures, and cocoa, and many others too. Okay, and again, like as I said, birds can also be pests. However, across studies, there tends to be very little damage on farms from birds. So a lot of those perceptions, there's not a solid scientific basis for those fears. There tends to be very little crop damage done by birds on farms. There are some exceptions, obviously, for some of these flocking birds, like red-winged blackbirds, cedar waxwings, and crows can do damage to some specific crops. We do see the same levels, though, of problems from birds, whether they're organic or non-organic farms. So this doesn't seem to be a pattern in terms of how you manage your farm for problem species. This here is just an example of strawberry damage from species like mockingbirds. So sometimes there can be sort of low-level damage done by birds that are actually migrants. Again, most of this work has been done either in Florida or the Midwest, or some in South America. So we don't really have a sense of what's going on in New England quite yet. So when we talk about, again, what farms are best for birds, this is sort of the idea that farmers try to keep birds out of their crops, because and there's also this perception that farms are wastelands for birds, which is not the case at all. And farms can provide good habitat for birds if they're managed in very specific ways. For example, organic farms. Studies have shown that organic farms tend to have more birds. So don't worry too much about specific bars on this, but this is just one example of looking at the difference between organic farms, which are the white bars, and non-organic farms, which are the darker bars. And organic farms tend to have both more birds and more species, whether it's early summer or late summer. And this is just one example. We see patterns like this across the board. And so why do they tend to like these organic farms better? Well, it seems to be related to diversity. So these organic farms tend to have more hedgerows. They look sloppy, which is not the right word I like for it, but they tend to have more crops. They tend to have more wetlands and edges and things that birds like. And there's usually a crop rotation because organic farms require more crop rotations and more diversity in actually their cash crops. So that seems to be what is driving that. And so what about breeding? So, okay, so we know these birds are here on the farms. Are they breeding there? Are these good habitats, or are they what we call habitat sinks in ecology? The birds are coming in but dying there and not producing, not reproducing. Well, the data tend to show that yes, they are doing really well on a lot of these farms, and particularly in farms that have less intensive farming. So here, when I'm talking about intensive farming, again, we're talking about monocultures, lots of pesticides, large areas of just one kind of landscape, one kind of habitat. So we find that different measures of breeding success. So over here we've got things like clutch size. That's one of the ways that we ornithologists measure success. Over here it's the number of fledglings. You can see that clutch size goes down as you have more intensive farming, and it goes up when you have more extensive farming activities. And what we mean by extensive is sort of low footprint kind of farming, the kind of stuff that probably goes on here at Wright-Locke. So to recap, are birds good for farms? Yes, in most cases, not in all. We never say all in science. So in most cases, yeah, it seems to be that the birds can do good things. It's called when we talk about ecosystem services or ecological services, they provide ecosystem services to these farms. And then which farms are good for birds? Tends to be diverse farms that use low-intensity farming measures. And then, so where are the win-wins? How do we find these win-wins, and how do we encourage these kinds of partnerships? Well, we know what works, just from example. There are bird-friendly farm practices that have been tested that are out there. So there's a lot of science out there and a lot of knowledge out there and information. Some of it's in farmers' hands, some of it is not, about what works and what are bird-friendly farm practices. There are a growing number of partnerships of working with private and municipal landowners, because in New England, a lot of these grasslands and farms now are owned by municipalities, as you know. A lot of them aren't private land anymore. So we call this the power of partnerships. And I'm going to go into some examples in a little while. And then getting consumers on board to support these farms. So some of the bird-friendly practices we know about, and this is just a handful, there's a lot of them out there, are things like maintaining hedgerows and borders. So if any of you have large swaths of land or are farm owners, these are some of the things you can do. Raising mower blades above 10 inches when you're doing mowing. Mowing around any known nests or outside of the nesting season. Sometimes we call these like sort of farming windows that we ask people to adhere to. Providing nest boxes for birds like kestrels and bluebirds and swallows. Eliminating or limiting pesticide use. crop rotations and keeping some fields fallow during some years, and planting what are known as bird-friendly crops. Now these are just a few of them, and they seem sort of obvious and easy to do, but I just want to make the point that there's challenges to these kinds of things. Farmers work on really, really small profit margins. Okay, they're not typically these big wealthy farms like you see out west. Also, they have to adhere to APR, or Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program. So those are restrictions that say that the farms must produce at least $500 in gross sales for the first 5 acres plus $5 for additional acres. So they have these really strict regimens that they have to follow in terms of production. And anything you ask them to do, and if they're working at these really thin margins to begin with, that's a lot to ask a farm. And there's still also this perception that birds are problems on farms. A lot of farmers just don't want them there. They think they're problems, but that seems to be changing.
How do they have those production?
I think it's for tax purposes. I think in order for you to get whatever tax benefits, it's whether it's most of it's federal. I'm guessing it's through the Farm Bill. Do you have anything to say on that one? No. So partnerships can help overcome some of these challenges. They provide often cash incentives for farmers. And I'll give you a couple of examples as we move forward. They can provide information on bird-friendly practices that are low cost, that are simple, they're not too complex. Any farm can implement them. Practices that serve multiple functions. So a lot of the practices also will attract pollinators, so insect pollinators, and most farmers want as many pollinators as they can get, good pollinators on their farms. So if you can suggest a measure that brings in pollinators as well, that's going to be great. And also that don't attract problem wildlife, because then you've blown the whole partnership. And also, these partnerships can help with public messaging. They can help get the word out that this is a good farm and everybody look what they're doing for birds. And it can promote agro-tourism. So this is a growing thing, like people will go to farms to bird, or people will go to farms just to be in nature because it's just a great place to be. And again, great example here at Wright Farm. And partnerships, these kinds of partnerships are on the rise. So this is just a handful of examples that I like to use. The first couple of them have to do with rice farming out west. So Audubon, California has a partnership with the California Rice Commission, and the Nature Conservancy has a partnership with called Farming for Wildlife, where they work with farmers. Both of them are ways that they encourage farmers to flood their fields during certain times of the year, mostly to promote habitat for waterfowl and migratory shorebirds. So these shorebirds are coming down, especially after they've bred in Alaska and northern Canada, and they really need these wetlands for breeding. There's the New Jersey Audubon Save program, which I think is a really creative example that I'm going to go into. And also the Bobolink program, which is also active here in Massachusetts. And like I said, this is just a handful of examples. Let's see, is there anything else I want to say about the TNC? I think both of those programs offer some kind of monetary support for farmers for doing that. So there's everybody sort of ends up even keeled. Now the Bobolink Project was a program that was started in Vermont by Audubon Vermont and Vermont Center for Eco Studies. And what it has since spread to Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Hampshire. I think it's administrated here in Massachusetts through Mass Audubon and some others. But what happens is that farmers agree to delay haying. Some of you may be familiar with this program, but they delay haying during nesting because it's been shown that to mow and hay during the bobolink breeding season is really bad for this bird. And it was pretty horrific. So farmers enroll land in a delayed haying strategy, and then they get compensated by working through this partnership, and the partnership gets donors, so people in the community who donate knowing that the money is going to go to help compensate these farmers, and it all sort of works out together. So it's pretty creative. And then Project Save, this was something that we started when I was back at New Jersey Audubon. I don't know if it's still active, but I think it's one of the most creative and interesting programs out there. It's based on science that shows that sunflowers are really good for birds. So in a situation like this, there's been science that shows that the birds will come in, they hang out on these sunflowers, and then they fly into the row crops and they eat the problem species out in those row crops, and they come back and hang on the sunflowers. And the more rows of sunflowers you have, the more benefit the farm actually gets from having those birds. So it really works out. So what happens is they form a partnership with New Jersey Audubon, and farmers produce a certain amount of sunflower seed as a cash crop. So they put some of their fields into pure sunflowers, which is then bought by New Jersey Audubon and packaged and sold as a local New Jersey bird-friendly product. And they both have conservation commitments. So farmers, when they're in this program, have to adhere to some of those bird-friendly practices that we talked about earlier. But then New Jersey Audubon also has a commitment that for every X number of acres that go into sunflowers, they then preserve actual natural grassland for birds as well. So there's kind of like benefits all over the place. It's also really great for agro-tourism. So I've been out there. And that's the New Jersey Safe seed. This is one of the sunflower seed farms. They've won all kinds of governorship awards, but I've been out there with busloads of birders coming out, or busloads of people just wanting photo opportunities, and the farmers love it. The farmers love it, the people love it. The bird seed was selling like crazy. And some of these guys would make like sunflower mazes. I mean, it was just, so I mean, the more creative you get with these things, the better. So what can you, as a customer, do to encourage these kinds of things? Well, first of all, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, is become a locavore and support your local farms. So buy mass grown from your local farms when you can, and become an advocate for them as well. And as I drove into the parking lot, I saw on farms and foods bumper stickers already. I took this one in Concord, where I live, last week. But become an advocate. Talk about local farms as much as you can. Talk to farmers. So when you're somewhere like a farmer's market or anywhere where you're going to be interacting with farmers, just start talking to them. It could be something as simple as, do you know what birds are on your farm? And you'd be surprised at how many do. And maybe, people that don't look like they care about birds are often the ones who know the most about birds. And so just show your interest and say, well, do you know what birds are on your farm? And then, if the conversation goes further than that, we can start saying, oh, well, what are you doing for birds on your farm? And express that you're sort of that you care what these farms are doing for birds, and that you would be more likely to buy their products if they were to then manage for birds. Also look for items branded with bird-friendly certifications. So there are more and more of these coming on the market. This here, Audubon Vermont produces or will certify maple syrup as bird-friendly, and I hope nobody asks me what those bird-friendly practices are, because I don't know what they are for maple syrup. But the Smithsonian Institute also has, the Smithsonian Museum, the Smithsonian Institute has a bird-friendly coffee program where they certify coffee grown in South and Central America as bird-friendly. It typically is shade coffee. So as you know, most coffee traditionally grown is sun coffee, so they have no shade trees. And all these birds that we care about, that's where they're going in the winter. So when we're seeing these declines, we don't live in a bubble. Some of them are experiencing their worst pressures down on the wintering grounds. So if anything you can do to support them down there, do as well. And there's all kinds of research, and UMass is doing research in Nicaragua. I can't remember. But so there's a ton of interest in this. Birds tend to do better on these shade coffee farms. There are some cultivars that grow in shade. And so that's another thing you can do.
So now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about my master's thesis research, which is specifically focused on New England farms, particularly in the Pioneer Valley, and specifically focused on shrubland birds. But first, a little bit more about me. Kim already went over this a bit, but I grew up in Washington State, in the Seattle area. I always knew I wanted to work with animals, and ended up getting my bachelor's degree at Washington State University, which is over in the eastern side of the state. And while I was there, I ended up working with a lot of education birds, like this golden eagle right here, and doing a lot of education programs at schools and community events. Really enjoyed that. And then after I graduated, I came out here to Maine. I worked with seabirds like this common tern and the Atlantic puffin for National Audubon Society's Project Puffin. And then I went to Nevada and worked for Hawkwatch International at one of their raptor banding and migration count sites in the Goshutes Mountains there. And now I'm a master's student at UMass Amherst, and I am studying birds on farms. All right, so to begin, so I wanted to start with just talking a little bit about shrubland birds, and to give you an idea, if you don't already know, of what we're talking about when we call something a shrubland bird, and what shrubland birds are in New England. Previous studies have identified 41 different species that we call shrubland birds, and it's a really diverse group of species. You have everything from mimids like the brown thrasher and the gray catbird. There's several warblers like this common yellowthroat, flycatchers like the alder and also willow flycatchers are shrubland birds, indigo bunting, and a number of sparrows like the song sparrow here. And what all of these species have in common is that they rely on early successional and shrubland habitats to breed in. Now, the other thing that they all have in common, or many of them have in common, is that they are in serious decline. And in New England, what we see is rates of decline that are actually much higher than those rates that Kim talked about from the rest of North America. So these are for New England specifically, and it surprises a lot of people because we often perceive many of these species as common backyard birds, such as song sparrows and common yellowthroats and cuckoos. But many of these species, the field sparrows, for example, are declining at these really drastic rates. And shrubland birds can use a variety of both natural and anthropogenic or human-created habitats. Among some of the natural habitats include pitch pine scrub oak, beaver meadows, wetlands, tree fall gaps, and other areas created by disturbance. And then also a lot of shrubland habitat is actually created by people. Such as silviculture activities, such as clear cuts, utility or power line rights of way, areas around forest edges, as well as abandoned agricultural fields consist of a lot of the shrubland habitat here in New England. And we also know that the primary threat facing these shrubland birds is habitat loss and fragmentation. Now, shrublands are essentially ephemeral habitats. So over time, they become lost to natural forest succession. And across New England, there's really not a lot of shrubland habitat. It only accounts for 12% of the total land cover in New England. And of that 12%, 71% is up in Maine. So down here in the southern New England, we really don't have a whole lot of shrubland habitat. Which is why human-managed or anthropogenic habitats are so important. And all this habitat loss is exacerbated by these human activities, such as interference in the natural disturbance regimes, like fire suppression over the years, and then, of course, urban development and agricultural intensification. And so despite the fact that all these shrubland birds are in decline, conservation of these species in New England has largely overlooked agricultural habitat and on farms. So here I am, and one of the major underlying questions that I'm trying to answer through my research is whether or not farms, and specifically these small, diversified, sustainable farms that we have here in Massachusetts, whether these are viable potential habitat alternatives for declining shrubland birds. And so as Kim already talked about in detail, when we look at farming trends across North America, we mainly see a lot of doom and gloom. There's Tons of this agricultural intensification increasing. So we see increased monocultures, less habitat heterogeneity, more chemical inputs, loss of these natural habitats in and around the farm areas. And then the farms themselves are getting a lot bigger. Since the 1960s in the US, we've seen a 16% increase in farm size. And then if you look at Canada, increased by almost 50%. However, New England may be an exception to this rule. In recent decades in particular, small farms have seen this sudden reemergence. This is from the 2012 USDA Census of Agriculture. They do this every 5 years. The 2017 one is yet to come out. But as you can see from this map here, if you look at New England compared to the rest of the country, and each one of these dots, the blue dots, are a 10-farm increase. There's a lot of small farms that are emerging here in New England, especially when you compare to the rest of the country. And what's more, these farms in New England appear to be becoming more environmentally sustainable. We see the widespread adoption of ecological farming practices like diversification, more limitations on chemical use. We see the reemergence of retained natural habitats like hedgerows, field margins, and things like that. Use of integrated pest management and permaculture. And we also see a lot of community support, as evidenced by all of you here today for sustainable food production. And in fact, Massachusetts actually ranks #1 in the nation for the percentage of farms involved in CSAs. So yeah, go Massachusetts. And according to another recent survey published by the USDA, CSAs are actually by and large very sustainable. In nearly 85% are either certified organic or they're producing according to organic standards without the certification. And furthermore, among these organic farms in Massachusetts, we see increasingly more and more farms adopting practices that benefit wildlife. I don't know if you can read these in the back, but this is a series of practices. We've got biological pest management, releasing beneficial organisms, creating insect and vertebrate habitat, planting buffer strips. It's a whole host of environmentally friendly farming practices. And this is where these were at with a percentage of total farms using these practices in 2008. And then if we look at, there's 2014. So we've seen these practices increasing by, double. So why does this matter? Why do these all matter for shrubland birds in particular? Well, first of all, shrubland birds tend to be less area sensitive than a lot of other, than grassland species, for example. And what area sensitivity refers to is, so shrubland birds don't need these vast expanses of land in order to breed. And so under the low sensitivity category here, we have northern bobwhites, goldfinches, field sparrows, song sparrow, yellowthroat. These are all shrubland birds. In addition, they also use more heterogeneous habitats like mixed grasses and shrubs and forbs, and we already know that they're using these abandoned farm fields and edge habitats. And so these are all things that reasonably could be found on small diversified farms. And what's more, many of these species eat insects, which means that they benefit from less chemical use, and they also have the potential to benefit the farms by providing these ecosystem services by eating pests. And here's a couple examples. These are actually photos from farms that I've surveyed. This is a little common yellowthroat, and I think it's got some kind of little plant hopper or aphid or something. This yellow-billed cuckoo was going to town on this gypsy moth caterpillar. They're doing really well this year. If you've seen the caterpillars this year, yep. So many of these shrubland birds are insectivores. All right, so to get started on my own research, the first thing I had to do was go out and find a bunch of farms. So I selected the Pioneer Valley as my study site, so mostly focused on Hampshire and Franklin County along the Connecticut River. And I emailed dozens of farms, got tons of responses, ended up meeting with each of my farmers personally, received and one-on-one, went to their farms, learned about them, and ended up with actually 22 farm sites, which amounted to 60 different survey locations. And I focused on farms that were fairly small. The largest farm, most of them are under 50 acres, a few are larger, and primarily focused on non-grassland type crops like vegetables, fruits, berries, things like that. And all of them are either certified organic or functional. And so far I've conducted one season of field work, and I'm in the middle of my second field season at the moment. And the field season starts from around the end of May, early June, and runs through mid-July. And over the course of the season, I complete 3 rounds of surveys in which I, first of all, conduct a standard 10-minute fixed radius point count. And all that means is I stand in the middle of a 50-meter radius circle for 10 minutes and record all the species that I see, all the number of individuals, how far away they are from me, the observer. And I also record certain behaviors that are of interest, such as breeding and feeding behaviors. And I also return to the plot later and sample the vegetation at 5 random points within defined land cover types. So because these small farms are so diverse, I also have to map out all the different habitat types on the farm. And I use a software program called ArcGIS to do this with these ortho photos that I get, sort of like Google Maps. The first thing I do is I map the edge of the farm, the extent of the farm, and then I assign my 50-meter fixed radius point count circle, delineate all the different habitat types. I have 10 habitat types in total, and so this is, for example, things like row crop, herbaceous, berries, hedgerow, shrub, as you can see. And then within each of these distinct habitat types, I scatter my vegetation sampling locations, and that's where I go to measure the height and density of the vegetation. And I also use them to calculate the percent coverage of these different habitat types. All right, so some results for you. So across all my point counts, and this is from last summer, I had 68 species total, and 23 of those were shrubland birds. And so this actually accounts for around 70% of all the shrubland birds that regularly breed in Massachusetts that I could have reasonably seen there. So I did pretty well, I think. And so after collecting all this data, the first question I was interested in was, how do shrubland birds compare to other species guilds or other habitat guilds on these farms? So I took all those 68 species that I saw, I organized them into categories based on their primary breeding habitats, and then I ran a statistical test to determine if there were significant differences between these guilds. And I did this for both abundance, individual abundance, and species richness, which is just the number of species present. And so for species richness, you can see here that shrubland birds came out on top. They were significantly higher than any of the other habitat guilds on the farms. And basically what this means is that on average, I had 4 species of shrubland bird per point. And again, for total abundance, we see the same thing even more dramatically. They were statistically significantly more abundant than any of the other habitat guilds, and on average I had around 10 shrubland birds per point, which is pretty impressive. Now, it's critical to mention that these shrubland bird abundance was heavily driven by just a few species, mainly goldfinches, catbirds, and last but not least, song sparrows. And so because song sparrows were so abundant on my farms, perfect species to focus on for my second question, which was how is the habitat, how is vegetation structure, so the height and the density, as well as habitat composition, which is the percent cover of different habitat types. How is this affecting the abundance of these song sparrows on these farms? So to give you an idea of how I modeled this, here's kind of a diagram here. So the modeling framework I used allowed me to account for imperfect detection of these song sparrows. So maybe I didn't see some of these birds because of things like the temperature, the time of day, how visually obscured the point was, or what day of the year it was. So I took those things into account, and then I looked at my vegetation structure variables, vegetation density and height, and then I took all of my habitat composition variables, and I had, as I mentioned, these 10 land cover types, and I compressed them down into these 4 categories. So I have herbaceous productive here, which includes row crops like vegetables, cover crop, hay. Herbaceous non-productive, which is fallow fields and natural herbaceous fields. Woody productive habitats, which included orchards and berries, and woody non-productive, which was natural areas like woodlands and shrubs and hedgerows and things like that. And here are the results. So as you can see here, so the 2 variables that came out as significant were the percent cover of herbaceous non-productive and the percent cover of herbaceous productive. And you can see there's a strong positive relationship between song sparrow abundance and the percent cover of these 2 land cover types. Now, an affinity towards natural herbaceous habitats isn't really a surprise for song sparrows. We know that they already like, forbs and ferns and grasses and things like that. They also nest usually near the ground in dense herbaceous vegetation. So that wasn't much of a surprise, but this second one, this positive relationship with things like row crops, this was more of a surprise. And possibly, song sparrows are more of a generalist species. Maybe they have a higher tolerance for human-altered landscapes. But it does raise this question, what are they actually doing in these row crops? What behaviors are they exhibiting? Why do they like these habitats? So if we look at a basic summary of just the raw behavioral data that I collected for song sparrows, we actually see some interesting trends here. And first of all, you can see most of the behavioral observations that I collected for song sparrows were in row crops. And of those, the vast majority are feeding behaviors, such as just foraging activity and carrying food and things like that. And you can see they also were feeding a little bit in cover crops and in fallow areas, but most of the time they were feeding in the row crops themselves. And then by contrast, if we look at breeding behaviors, such as singing and displaying males and chick provisioning and copulation, juvenile birds. These are all happening in non-productive habitats and natural habitats, such as the herbaceous areas, hedgerows, woodlands, shrubs, and things like that. So there's this dichotomy between the breeding habitat, or the breeding behaviors, and the feeding behaviors going on here, which is very cool. All right, the results of my habitat guild analysis, it does appear that shrubland birds are significantly higher for abundance and species richness than my other habitat guilds, which does lend support to the idea that these farms are a good alternative habitat for shrubland birds. And then secondly, as far as song sparrows go, they appear to not only be positively associated with these natural herbaceous habitats, but they're also using the productive habitats as well, such as row crops and cover crops. And then on top of that, we see that the habitat used by song sparrows is not equally distributed, or the behaviors that are going on are not equally distributed throughout the habitat types. So again, we see breeding behaviors in more of the non-productive habitats and feeding behaviors in things like row crops. And this is particularly cool for song sparrows because they are one of those shrubland birds that's highly insectivorous during the breeding season. And so it's reasonable to say that these birds might be providing an ecosystem service because they're feeding in these row crops, they're eating insects, they're feeding insects to their chicks. So these results are fairly preliminary at this point, and there's a lot of questions I still have to answer. Mainly, once I have a second season of data collected, I can conduct these habitat analyses for other shrubland birds. I can expand the spatial scale of these analyses. Obviously, these birds are affected by a lot more than what's just going on within a 50-meter fixed radius point count circle. So I intend to look at the surrounding habitat, the proximity to water and things like that. And also look at what the farm practices, how the farm practices are affecting birds. And finally, go more in depth on the behavioral data and really try to get at this question of whether certain species are providing these ecosystem services. So before we wrap things up, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the farmers that have helped me with this project. They have been so welcoming and so supportive and open to the idea of having me running around on their farms at odd hours of the morning counting birds. And they've really embraced this project. Many of my farms have a broad social media presence and have actually taken the time to introduce my project to their followers on Instagram, for example. And we've seen a really positive response to that from the public. And the note I really want to end on here is that this farming culture that we have in New England is really unique, first of all. And we should all be really proud to be a part of it. And to be a part of a community that cares about birds, cares about the environment, and values sustainability. So with that, and knowing that these small diversified farms are actually supporting or good for declining bird species, such as shrubland birds, go out and support your local farms, and know that by doing this, you're also supporting bird species. Thanks. All right. So the question was, what were the first conclusion that I made? Just a clarification. So the first analysis that I ran was to look at how different habitat guilds, so shrubland birds versus birds that nest in forested habitats versus birds that nest in grasslands, wetlands. So I believe it was 5 different of these habitat guilds, and I organized all the species that I saw into a bin, into a habitat guild, and then compared them all. So, and the result was that shrubland birds were significantly more abundant, and they had a higher species richness than any of the other habitat guilds on my farm. So the conclusion there was that shrubland birds, were the dominant group of species that I had. Yeah.
A mile or so from here is Lexington Farm and the Arlington Reservoir right next to each other, and I've noticed that killdeer are flying around there and nesting in the farm grass, and I'm wondering what's going to happen to them and whether the farmers know they're there or whether they're out of there in time to avoid plowing and so forth. Do you know anything about the killdeer, and what category of bird are they in terms of grassland or whatever?
Killdeer are shorebirds, but I consider them a habitat generalist. So my son texted me from high school just a few weeks ago and said, we have them nesting on the football field. So they will nest just about anywhere where there's open space. In terms of whether or not the land managers know the bird is there, one of the good things about killdeer, for those of you who bird, know that killdeer will let you know they're there, right? So that's a good thing. They tend to nest early, as a lot of shorebirds do. But if you know the landowners, I would suggest letting them know. I mean, especially if there's a lot of birding community there and they're watching, especially when the chicks are vulnerable and they're called precocial. They're precocial species. So as soon as they hatch, the little babies are running around. That's when they're particularly vulnerable to these kinds of harvesting practices. So that's when you would want to let the landowner know.
At Waltham Fields Farm, when the killdeer nested, we figured out where it was, and they stayed away from the nest. And of course, the killdeer lets you know by pretending it has a broken wing to lead you away from its nest.
That's true, and they're really vocal. And a lot of landowners will do that. If they know the nest is there, then they will mow around it. They'll set up flags, and they seem to be pretty amenable to that.
Besides insect removal, are there any other important ecosystem services that birds provide?
For farms and specifically?
Yes, for farms.
I think that, okay, so there's a lot of things that they can do. Sometimes if there are problematic species around, if you have species that you do want there, they will swarm or mob, what are known as the problem species. There may be some evidence out there that they provide fertilizer by bird poop, but I don't know how strong that evidence is. Maybe that's something that Isabel could study next. But I can't think of any other right off the top of my head. I'm sure, I know there are, and they're just not on the tip of my tongue. They kill the woodchucks? Yeah. Yeah, so when I think about problem species on farms, all of these, a lot of them will be mammalian. Some of them will be sort of those problem bird species we talked about. I love crows, but farmers, they're not great for farmers. So the question is it just the pest insect species that are going to be the focus of shrublands, and what is it going to be there on shrublands, and also sort of what are the trends in those insects? So some of them are considered helpful insects, right? So we love ladybugs, we love anything that will eat aphids, right? So yeah, I'll answer, and then I'm going to let Isabel answer as well, since we're talking about shrubland birds, but there's a lot of focus right now on what's going on with insects. One of the main hypotheses right now for the problem behind why the aerial insectivores are shrinking is because what we call sort of the airspace is emptying out. So everything they eat in the airspace is becoming almost like a food desert. And it's probably tied to pesticide use. And there are a lot of people looking at this right now. They're really creative ways of studying it, like almost like these sort of drag nets behind planes and catching and sort of doing these sampling spaces in the air. And it's actually pretty scary how significant the drop has been in those kinds of insects.
It's something I'd love to look at on my farms, and I know, I'm not sure, I don't think it's been studied on farms too much. There aren't too many studies out there that have actually characterized the species, the insect species that are present. I can really only say from anecdotal things that I've seen on the farms, and yeah, it's the birds don't discriminate between pest species and non-pest species, that's for sure.
So I taught ornithology at a couple of different schools, and we have a whole class on this. They're not bird brains. They're smart, especially you look at species like corvids and even these chickens who are walking around here, not the smartest bird species, but still not stupid. And there are people who, if you've watched any of the shows on PBS and Nature, the Nature series, some of these crows and ravens do as well as toddlers and young children on some of these intelligence tests, and they often outcompete dogs. So, no, they're not stupid at all. Yeah.
The only thing I'm going to add to that is that they recently discovered that pigeons can count to 9.
That is awesome, because pigeons, yeah. So the question is, do birds eat ticks? And the answer is yes, right? So I don't know. I don't know. During this breeding season, birds are really not very discriminatory in their protein sources. So they will just about eat anything. Sure, and I brought a slide that I didn't show specifically for that question because I knew it was coming. So again, when I do public programs, I talk about birds and contaminants, and I haven't done this in a while, but just the question is about what is the significance of neonicotinoids, which are now the most prevalently used pesticides used on farms and lawn care and on plants that you buy at Home Depot. It's everywhere at this point. So up through 1972. DDT, which we're all pretty familiar with, and other organochlorines were the primary pesticides and contaminants that we were finding having an effect on birds. Then in the 1970s and through the 1990s, carbamate and organophosphorus compounds were the problem, including monocrotophos. Okay, if anybody knows how to pronounce it better than I. I don't remember, I don't know if anybody ever saw some of the videos that were coming out of Argentina where they were getting massive amounts of Swainson's hawks killed offs. And it's really horrid, but some of this chemical actually got into some of the preschools, and it was awful. So then in the 1990s, we moved away from using those. And now since the 1990s, there's a newer class of insecticides known as neonicotinoids. And they are used on all kinds of plants. Like I said, you can find them on just about anything you buy at any of the major nurseries. The science on neonics, and you're not going to love this answer, but the science on neonicotinoids is not 100% there yet. And so I'm always sort of cautious on what I recommend in these situations. I personally, a lot of the stores now will label a plant that's been treated with neonicotinoids. And if I have that option, I buy the one without the neonics. In terms of the science behind it, the American Bird Conservancy has done some work on this where they've shown that when birds get to certain levels of this particular pesticide class of chemicals, it is really toxic to them. The question is whether there's enough in the environment where it's affecting them. And the same thing with bees. So all these hive collapses that we hear about, the tie between neonicotinoids and bee collapse is not quite there. So I'm hesitant to say that is the main reason. It could be one. So, right, that and whatever other insecticides they're using are out there are, yeah, that's where I would think the primary effect is going to be. And that, like I said, this is a huge issue, this loss of our aerial insects, and all the sort of cascading effects that happen after that. Another thing I just want to mention, rodenticides, very, very, very bad. The connection is clear for raptors, okay? I was just talking to a friend of mine today who was a raptor expert, and he was studying American kestrels, and all of the dead kestrels that they found this year had really high levels of rodenticide in their system. So neither Isabel or I are policymakers. I do think there is an increasing effort by the scientific community to communicate more with policymakers and lawmakers and regulators. So I think the science and the communication is out there. There's also more public outreach that's going on, and I do think you do see some of this translated. I mean, I think the neonicotinoid labeling effort was either a local policy movement or public. It was because of public outcry. Well, I'm a consultant, so I'm meeting with regulators all the time, not about this stuff. I work with the wind and solar industries now, so we talk about wind and solar issues. But there's a lot of communication that goes on. We go to these conferences, and I would say it's 1/3 Fish and Wildlife Service and state wildlife agencies, and then 1/3 academics, and then 1/3 nonprofit, and a sprinkling of for-profit people in there as well. And industry representatives.
It's definitely good to take your bird feeders down in the summer if you have bears, especially. There's a lot of mammals that'll come to bird feeders, especially during the summer. Let's see. I mean, I think that's about it. I mean, it's definitely a good thing. Definitely keep your bird feeders up in the winter. That's all I can say.
And keep your cats away from them.
Most of us probably have gardens, and they are, in a sense, shrublands. Is there any advice that you might give us about plant selection or about geometry of our gardens, design of our gardens, to increase bird habitat?
Sure, I think we both can probably answer a little bit on that one. So one of the things I always say is let them get messy. So allow things like brush piles. So I do this in my yard, is that when you're cleaning up your yard, make them into brush piles because these birds depend on them for predator avoidance a lot. And so that's always helpful. Planting several different kinds of plants in your garden is also helpful. There are entire manuals out there on what bird-friendly plants you can plant, especially for things like hummingbirds. And also just to keep the edges. So if you have sort of like, they wouldn't be called hedgerows in your own personal garden, but sort of edgy, shrubby areas that you might not think look the prettiest, and people are always worried people are going to think I have a messy yard. Leave them and let it look like a prairie a little bit.
Yeah, Kim covered it pretty well, but Yeah, brush piles, one thing I've really noticed on the farms that I've been surveying, brush piles are great areas, particularly for sparrows and things like that. Compost piles can also be a huge draw for a lot of bird species. Dead snags, if you have any dead snags in your yard, or perch type structures, those are great for attracting raptors. I'll get back to you on species. I haven't analyzed my plant species data yet. So yeah, sunflowers are great. Yeah.
And bird boxes, nesting boxes are a limiting factor, what we consider a limiting factor for a lot of these birds. So always any kind of a cavity that you can provide, and look up the specs online so you just don't end up with a million starlings and house sparrows. So most of what we talked about today was very specific to agriculture. So we were talking about row crops and growing food for people, and then how that can be compatible with bird conservation. But there's a whole nother branch of science that's just looking at what is best for these birds overall. If we had our way and there were no people on the planet and we just wanted to help the birds, what could we do? And one of the things I said at the beginning of my talk is that a lot of these habitats are now in municipal hands. So they're owned by the state, they're owned by the feds, they're owned by the local municipalities, and a lot of them are being managed specifically for these birds. And it's a whole nother suite of options that's there. Most of the work that I do is on these big wind farms out west. Most of them are in large agricultural landscapes, and they're considered low risk to most birds. In situations where we think, there may be eagles in the area or something, then opens up a different story, and we do a lot more planning there. But in New England, not so much. I have been working more and more on the East Coast on solar projects. So understanding, what the balance is between creating renewable energy that's low carbon or no carbon, which we know is really important for the species, for the future of a lot of these species, because, one of the key drivers of extinction risk for these species is going to be global climate change. And so trying to find that balance in promoting sustainable energy, at the same time minimizing risk to the extent that we can. And I find that working, I'm an independent sort of risk assessment specialist. And so I'm supposed to be independent, and I also care about birds a lot. So what I do is work with these developers, and most of them, I'm going to say more than 95% want to do the right thing. They're in this business for a reason. They feel like they're part of the solution on a global scale. And, it's not like if I were working for ExxonMobil, I think things would be different. Like they're not going to do the things that I'm asking them to do with these companies. And working with communities as well to figure out siting and smart siting. Yeah, I mean, there's this whole sort of process now that goes on with these developers and the agencies. So Fish and Wildlife Service came up with these guidelines. And so every time you even want to put up one turbine, you work your way through these guidelines, and you are in touch with the agencies. And these are the regulators who are concerned with endangered species. They're concerned with birds. And they walk you through every step, and they're watching you really closely. And this doesn't happen with other industries. I can tell you that for sure. Okay, so there's less known about the impacts. So the question is, what are the impacts with solar? Can anybody didn't hear that? So we're talking about large sort of utility scale solar projects. There's less known, but the number one issue is that when you put solar panels on, that's habitat removal, right? You may as well be putting a mall there, except it's a mall that's doing some really good things, right? And there's also some hypotheses out there, especially out in the desert. So there's a lot of development going on out in the southwestern states and in Southern California, where there may or may not be some perceived vision of water with some of these waterfowl. So when they're flying over, they may try to land on the solar panels thinking it's water. And if it's something like a loon, which cannot take off unless it's in water, then you have a real problem. I don't know too much about actual like injuries or deaths from collisions. I haven't heard so much about that. It's more so if an animal gets down there and then can't leave. Yay.
Thank you so much all for coming, all for listening, for answering these questions, for sure.